Hello, and welcome to this episode of Central Valley Stories, Advertising and Public Relations. On this podcast, we talk history, trends, changes, and challenges with some of the region's veteran practitioners and agency owners. I'm your host, Professor Betsy Hays, in the Media, Communications, and Journalism Department at Fresno State. Enjoy! All right, we are here with Scott Gediman, who is a public affairs officer and park ranger for Yosemite National Park, and definitely has one of the most interesting public relations jobs in the Central Valley. So to get us started, Scott, let's provide our listeners with some context for the conversation. So share with us a little bit about you and your career path.
Thank you, and it's nice to be here. I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and came on family vacations to Yosemite National Park every year. Ever since I was a little boy, I've always wanted to be a park ranger in Yosemite National Park, and that was and still is my singular focus. I went to high school in Los Angeles, went to San Diego State University, and got my degree in journalism, public relations, and started with the National Park Service at Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, which people may know better as Lake Powell. Worked there off and on for about 5 or 6 years, worked in the tourism industry, worked at Grand Canyon National Park for a season, and got to Yosemite 27 years ago. So it's been a great career, and I'm still going.
Oh, that is so much fun. And I know a lot of our listeners will have been to one or all of those national parks. So it's fun to have that context. So why did you choose the public affairs side of national parks? What drew you to that piece of the work?
I've always loved the national parks and always wanted to be a park ranger. Within the national parks, there's a lot of specialty areas. Some rangers specialize, for example, in law enforcement or search and rescue or in biology, resource management. But I've always loved the public relations aspect of it. I've always been very outgoing and love to talk to people and love to be with groups. And so I thought to be able to be in a public relations role in a national park would just be the ultimate. And it's something that I've always wanted to do, and I'm just absolutely thrilled, blessed, and grateful for the career that I've had.
I love that so much. And it really is the perfect marriage, right? Of being able to be in the environment that you adore and doing the work that you were called to do. What was it like when you first started? When you first started as a public affairs officer, maybe kind of talk us through those early days and the kinds of things that you were doing.
Well, what's interesting is that people ask me in my 27 years at Yosemite, I've had a myriad of different titles, a myriad of different jobs, but at its core, it's always been communication. I've always been a spokesperson for the press. I've alternately run park visitor centers, information booths. Now I focus on other things, and so it's just really a whole variety of things. But again, the press is something that I've always done, and so I'll never forget literally walking into my office 27 years ago, and there was a person in my job temporarily. I walked in and she said, "Okay, these reporters want to talk to you. Do these interviews." And this was literally within 5 minutes of when I started. So the media has changed quite a bit, as people know, but in those early days, it was just doing interviews, phone interviews, and in-person interviews.
Speaking of interviews, do you know how many media interviews that you have done throughout your career? That's probably a number that is very large. I know that, but have you counted them?
That's a great question, and I haven't counted exactly thousands of them. I mean, it's interesting because, over the years with a particular incident, for example, probably about 15 years ago where we had a horrible tragedy with some people lost their lives in a waterfall, I counted over 2 days. I did about 180 interviews just in those 2 days. And so as the media has changed, I'm doing less in terms of quantity, but in the early days, I would easily do, over 1,000 interviews a year. I would get 150 television crews, film crews, and do all kinds of just different media. And so it's just a huge amount of media interest. And that's something within the national park, some people feel Yosemite gets too much attention, but we're clearly an iconic national park and the media is drawn to the park. And so although the media has changed, the media interest has not only remained constant, but has been elevated recently.
Absolutely. Speaking of that, From a media perspective, we're not just talking local media, right? We're talking regional, national, and even international. Is that correct?
That is correct. What's interesting is, in the early days when I would send out a news release, believe it or not, actually fax news releases out and talk to people, we've always had just different layers. And so what's interesting is when we say local in Yosemite, we consider the Central Valley local in Fresno. So for example, we'll get a lot of the TV affiliates from Fresno. On a regional level, we'll get outlets from San Francisco, Los Angeles, but we'll also get a ton of international outlets. And so this is everything from, for example, BBC, Reuters, AFP, American Foreign Press. And so what's interesting is over the years, we've actually gone to more international media than the local media, but it's always been at different levels. And that's been a real interesting part of my job because, although I certainly want to be consistent and need to be consistent with where I talk, one of the things I've done over the years is learning how to basically tailor my message, whether I'm talking to the Fresno Bee, for example, is one, I'll do something versus USA Today on the print side versus CNN on the TV side. And so it's so interesting because, I think to myself from the media perspective and from the journalist perspective that I certainly want to provide them an accurate story that reflects well on the park, but also resonates with their audience. And so that's something that I've worked on and continue to work on is, of course, the content of the message stays the same, but how it's delivered and what mechanism I try to tailor to the specific outlet and the audience that outlet generates.
Thank you. Share one of your early favorite career moments.
One of my early favorite career moments, I would say way back in my Glen Canyon days, when they were talking about flows through the Glen Canyon Dam that went through the Grand Canyon, there was a lot of controversy with that. It just became known, this is almost 30 years ago, about the environmental impacts of dams. And so I remember at the time, Bruce Babbitt was the Secretary of Interior, and we had all of the media events, and the Bureau of Reclamation worked with us at Glen Canyon. So I remember Bruce Babbitt was coming down, and they were doing a big press conference, and ABC News was coming and everybody was coming, and I was a 20-something young ranger, and they said, "Hey Scott, you like the media, you're good at it. Here's the secretary, do interviews." And so I found myself doing interviews for ABC News, NBC News, and CNN, and it was just a blast. But it was just one of those things. I didn't have training for it. I didn't have any sort of introduction. It was just go and do it. And that's so much in our world, as people know, that so much of it is learning as you're doing. And I just remember those days as it was just magical in a way, because now as the environment has changed so much, and what they're doing at Glen Canyon is just basically what they do every day in terms of flows. Back then, it was a brand new thing. And so I feel privileged in the sense that I was part of the original way that it was communicated, how we do what we call adaptive management.
So let's talk about how things have evolved over your career. First, start with structure. So you have your public affairs office at Yosemite. How has the office structure sort of evolved over the years? Have you, at one time, did you have more people, less people? Obviously, there's the social media component that wasn't there when you first started. Can you just talk just a little bit about how that is kind of ebbed and flowed, right? I would assume that would be the way to describe it.
It certainly has ebbed and flowed, and that's a great description of it. In the role that I possess with communicating for the park, it's always been the news media, elected officials, tourism officials, international, parks across the world, or media outlets throughout the world. And so what's interesting is that I would have seasonal rangers, what we call rangers that work for the summer. Had those for a while and haven't had those for years. Had 2 people, then 3 people, and it's kind of ebbed and flowed over the years with the workload, and ended up with just one other person. And the ranger, Jamie Richards, who was wonderful, left the park almost 2 years ago, and I've been on my own. And so it's really challenging right now simply with the demand, but it's one of those things where my responsibilities now are mainly the press, the what we call legislative affairs, the politics, the tourism bureaus, special events, and things like that. And what's interesting is our social media team, who I work closely with, is actually under what's called the Division of Interpretation. And interpretation within the National Park Service are the folks that work in the visitor center, leads the walks and talks and things like that. And that's actually how I got my start. But what's interesting is that social media within the parks were looked at in the early days as simply educational tools to get out out messages about, bear behavior, trees, impacts of snow, things like that. Whereas now we're using social media in an entirely different way. And so it's so interesting because that's one of our current challenges. Although all communication comms, as we call it, goes through my office, the social media department is in a different shop. And so it creates some challenges, but it's one of those things structurally, I feel that we should go to more of a communication structure the way that, we see private industry doing it, where, a lot of times advertising, marketing, public relations, social media are all within one umbrella or are consolidated better. And with the government, after over 30 years total in, we're slow to kind of adapt to things. And so we're getting there, but we have a ways to go.
Let's talk a little bit about the celebrity side of things. Celebrities love to go to Yosemite. Sometimes they want publicity surrounding their visits. Sometimes they don't, which I'm sure is both things are interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the celebrity component that you've experienced?
Sure. It's interesting for me growing up in Los Angeles. I grew up around the entertainment industry and always saw a lot of filming. In fact, probably 3/4 of my friends right now still live in LA and they're in the entertainment industry. So it's something I've been familiar with. And so it's so interesting with the celebrity component of it. Because as you mentioned, celebrities come up to the park for all different reasons. And so I've been fortunate to be able to meet a lot of celebrities, and we've done a lot of great projects. For example, the ultimate, I feel is Oprah Winfrey. We did the Oprah Winfrey show. It was her last season, and she was in the park to talk about camping and to try to encourage more African Americans to go camping. And so we had an incredible experience with Oprah and Gail, who camped for a couple of days, and that is a several-hour story in and of itself. But we've had, Rachel Ray, for example. We did Rachel's Vacation. I've been able to meet Kenny Rogers selling videos. I'm a country music guy. And so lots of celebrities like that. And then also they'll come up just to kind of learn about the park. And so, for example, a real great experience, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who's a wonderful actress, came up several years ago with her family wanting to know how to get more involved in the park. And so we'll get people like that. And then sometimes the celebrities will just show up. And it's interesting because I'll get sometimes calls or texts or emails saying, Sean Penn is in the park, or, someone like that. And then they'll say, oh, did you know they were there? And my joke is there's not a sign at the entrance station that says, celebrities, please check in with Ranger Scott. However, I kind of joke, I think there should be. But we do get a lot of them in the park. And sometimes like at the Ahwahnee, which is our world famous luxury hotel, National Historic Landmark, if a celebrity checks in, depending on the level of them, we'll get sometimes their management or security will let us know. And so it's always so interesting with celebrities. But I still, even though I've got to meet a lot of them, I still enjoy it and I still get a kick out of it. And it's always fun to see a celebrity's persona, whether they're in film or television or music, and to see how they are in person. It's a lot of fun.
The other piece that I find fascinating, I guess is sort of related to the celebrities. A lot of folks come up and film TV shows and movies and those sorts of things. And so that has been interesting over the years, how many people want to use and ask to use Yosemite as their set for their creative activities.
Right, and that's a great question, a great thought. What's interesting is when I was at Glen Canyon, for example, big wide open park, I got to work on films like Ravenhawk and Maverick with James Garner, Mel Gibson, and Jodie Foster. Got to work on Broken Arrow with John Travolta and Christian Slater, and we would accommodate crews 200, 300, 400 people. But in Yosemite, we just don't have the infrastructure for it, meaning we don't have the hotel rooms and the space. And so, for example, Star Trek, I think it was Star Trek 3 was filmed in the park a little bit before my time. I wasn't there. But with us, we do get a lot of television shows, and we'll get movies, and they'll come in, and sometimes they'll just want to come in and do like establishing shots or B-roll, and sometimes they'll want to do an interview in the park. It just depends. And so, for example, last summer, we actually filmed a pilot. And what's interesting is people that watch TV know that, the real popular shows right now, like FBI, CSI, things like that, some producers had this idea for one of these shows, this crime drama set in a national park. And so they came to us and said, hey, we want to film it. And they were also going to film in Albuquerque and other places. And so I said, sure. And so we filmed and we did some great stuff. And we were just in different locations. And they wanted to show that these were rangers solving crimes in a national park. And we just had a ball, and they were, professional actors, and we had the craft services, the food, and we had the wardrobe and all of that kind of stuff. And it was a great experience. Unfortunately, the show wasn't picked up, but it's a lot of fun to film things like that. And it's always fun to see how they turn out.
The other piece, speaking of visitors, right? So we've talked about celebrities and film crews, and you also have a lot of politicians and elected officials who, for obvious reasons, want to go to Yosemite and maybe host a meeting, or it's part of their constituency, or, they're a cabinet person in the federal government. So a lot of both local and national political figures want to come to Yosemite. And I would imagine from a coordination standpoint, that's a lot of details, and they fall on you, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and that's, again, a great question, and that's another part of my job that I really enjoy. As you mentioned, we'll get everyone from our local members of Congress. We'll get congressional groups. For example, this summer, we had 150 members of the Republican Party that came with 10 members of Congress, and they came for a trip called part of the Western Caucus, kind of looking at issues, and then we conducted a congressional field hearing. And so that one was logistically very challenging because they wanted a park tour with buses. And so of those 11 members of Congress, the rest of the 150 were staffers. They were staff from other members and family and lobbyists and things like that. So it's always real tricky. That one was wonderful, and we had a congressional hearing. We had 7 members from the House Climate Change Caucus and all kinds of things. But of course, the ultimate, as I like to say, is when we hosted President Obama and the First Family. And again, as friends said, don't get Ranger Scott talking about President Obama. But basically, back in 2016, which was the centennial, the 100th anniversary of the national parks, there was a huge public relations and communications push around the National Park Service. And so President Obama was ending his term and wanted to go to a different park. And they looked around at a few parks. And I, of course, did everything I could to make it that they would want to come to Yosemite, and they did. And so it was so incredible. We had, the helicopter, Marine One, fly in. President Obama, the First Lady, Sasha and Malia, the First Family came. It was phenomenal. We did a press conference. We did an activity with kids, every kid in the park with 4th graders. We took them hiking. And you talk about logistics. We had the law enforcement component of it. We had the White House press corps. We had the logistics. We had where they were going to do a speech. We had the kids. And so that was a lot of fun. And so for me, as I look back on my career, I've had a lot of highlights, but that was just the ultimate. And I look back, and when we were preparing it, it was so interesting because they would have me around the park and they would take photos, and they would take them and they were looking at them, and I didn't know, but they were sending all these photos back to the president and the first lady each night saying, this is what you can do and these are the activities. And they were also using me, which I found out I'm the exact same height as the president. So when they needed to have where to put a podium or where to stage something, I was kind of the stand-in. And so what's interesting is that when the helicopter landed and we're in our dress uniforms and they came up, I'll never forget this as long as I live. They walked down the line and the president looked at me, and I have a name tag that says my name. And so he knew who I was. He didn't know me, but he looked me in the eye and said, thank you, Scott, for all that you did to make this visit possible. And my first thought was, oh my God, you're the president of the United States. And then he went on to say, I want to come back, and next time come back with less impact. And that just meant so much that he was so self-aware, knowing that there was so much prep that had to go in. But all I can say is the president, the First Family, all of their staff were incredibly gracious, incredibly wonderful. We just had an amazing time, and they left on Sunday morning. It was Father's Day weekend, and I'll never forget standing in the Iwani Meadow, and they boarded the helicopter and they took off, and I just thought to myself, oh my gosh, I said, they just had an incredible weekend. Nobody got hurt. No, we didn't cancel any weddings. We didn't cancel any hotel reservations. Everything went well. They had a wonderful visit, and I just remember thinking to myself, oh my God, this is incredible. And to this day, I look back and just have nothing but wonderful memories.
The level of detail involved in some of these visits, I think, is really worth underlining, because I don't think a lot of people, everybody sees the finished product, right? They see the appearance and the event. And I think it really is worth kind of making sure everybody understands the myriad of details that go into something like that, right? And working with the advanced team and knowing that there are things like an advanced team that come out and block out everything, right? It's really like you're orchestrating a play. Everything has to be organized and scripted, and the sets and the environment and everything before the actors, right? Meaning the elected officials come on to the set. And that's a lot. And I'm sure that it gets easier, right, over the years. However, the volume of the details probably doesn't decrease.
Well, that's a great point. And that's so interesting because, of course, when President Obama visited, that was huge. And we had advanced teams and Secret Service teams and all of that. But another good example recently we have is a Secretary of Interior. So, for example, Deb Haaland right now is the current Secretary of Interior. I'm very fortunate to have met her several times and have known her. In fact, she was a member of Congress from New Mexico before she was appointed Secretary of Interior. So I met her back then. But when a secretary comes, for example, they're a member of the president's cabinet. So they have security with them. They have their press people. They have their logistics people. So what's interesting is that it's a whole process where you find out, okay, here's an agenda. You kind of say what you want to do, and then you take that agenda and then you work with the secretary's staff. And then once the agenda is fleshed out, then they'll come out and you do walkthroughs. You have to go through. And it's all the things people don't think about. Vehicles, you've got to have 3 or 4 vehicles minimum. Where are you going to put the vehicles when you go to places? Where is the public going to interact with them? Is there a press component? Do they have prepared remarks? Is there any political things going on? For example, I've had cases where other secretaries, and I've met, all of the secretaries during my career, sometimes something might happen that might be unrelated to their visit, but impacts it. And so you've got to be aware of a lot of things, but anything from a secretary level requires a huge amount of planning and a huge amount of orchestration and is a lot of fun. But as we move to a different era and Yosemite becomes more and more busy and people come in, the challenges are not harder, that they're different. And so, for example, we just had the secretary in the park a few weeks ago, and it was a short visit and it went really well. But for example, we were going to do press and they were going to do something. And so they asked me to organize a press event. And then at the last minute, they decided that they weren't going to do press. And so it's things like that where we just have to be flexible and be able to pivot. And we're very fortunate in Yosemite that colleagues, I have like law enforcement rangers, for example, or resource managers or biologists. And so with the secretary, we say we're going to go here, we're going to go there. And the law enforcement rangers would lead us in the vehicles or call ahead to have parking spaces set aside, because people don't realize if you're going to a place like Glacier Point or Tunnel View and you pull in, there's going to be hundreds of cars. There's not going to be any spaces. And so if there's not advanced planning, to come in and just expect you're going to pull up and get out is just unrealistic. And so that kind of stuff, it's always fun and challenging. And it's something that I enjoy doing it. I think I've gotten, better at it over the years. And it's just a really great challenge. And it's something I really enjoy.
Let's talk animals. I know over the years you've had foxes and bears and all kinds of animals related to your job, which of course is not what a typical public relations professional has to deal with on a regular basis, but you have, and I know that that has been an interesting part of your job. So perhaps maybe share an animal story.
I think a good one has to do with our bears. Yosemite National Park is home to about 350 to 400 black bears. The grizzly bears are native to the park, but unfortunately have been killed off, and so all the bears in the park are black bears. But when I got to the park in the mid-90s, for the first 4 or 5 years, we had all kinds of car break-ins. It was typical for a car to be broken into, or 3 or 4 cars every night. This was because if people leave either food in their car or something that has a scent like shampoo or toothpaste, the bears are opportunistic eaters and they would break into the car and get the food. And so rather than quote unquote punish the bears or do something because they're looking for food, we wanted to focus our efforts on human behavior. And so several TV shows that were talking about this problem we had everything from Nightline, Dateline, ABC News, Primetime Live. And then we did a National Geographic show. And the producer of the National Geographic show, her husband happened to work for a member of Congress from Los Angeles who's retired. His name was Henry Waxman. And once we showed that we had this issue with food storage and educating visitors, the congressman got $500,000 allocated to the park for bear awareness. And so one of the things I'm most proud of is we started the Keep Yosemite Bears Wild campaign, and this was aimed at educating park visitors. When you come into the park, you have a responsibility to store your food properly, put it in a bear box in the campground, don't leave it on your picnic table. And so that campaign has been enormously successful. At its peak, we had about 1,200 incidents a year that had over $600,000 in property damage. And as of a couple of years ago, we've gotten down to literally a handful of incidents and a few $1,000s worth of property damage. And so that is continuing. And then just recently, we've decided to refresh the campaign because when we started the campaign over 20 years ago, a lot of the things that we did, for example, press conferences and flyers and buttons, are all good. But now we look at things like videos and, a lot more ways people communicate, social media. And so I was very fortunate in my work with your classes in Fresno State. In fact, just last semester, Talk PR, you assigned them to basically refresh the bear campaign. And that was a wonderful experience because the students came up with great new slogans. For example, we always say to slow down. And so one of the slogans they came up with was drive like your Cubs live here. And they came up with new graphics and they came up with those kind of things. And so that's the beauty of it, that the messages are still the same, but the way we deliver them and the content has changed. And to be able to incorporate that work with the Fresno State students who are not only learning PR, but those are the students that are going to be the practitioners in the industry when they get out and graduate college is a lot of fun. And so, everybody loves bears, and it's just been so fun over the years just to do so much work with bears. And I've also been fortunate that, I get to see a lot of bears, and it's just a lot of fun. And, who doesn't love bears?
The students had such a wonderful time working on that campaign. That was a really, really great opportunity for them. So let's talk about technology. Obviously, things have changed significantly regarding technology and the public relations world. You mentioned a little bit ago, and we sort of both chuckled about the fact that you used to fax out news releases. And I remember at the first agency I worked for, we sat around and mailed news releases. And at that time, I remember there were 200 daily newspapers in California and 500 weeklies. And so we would put 700 news releases in envelopes in order to get things out statewide. So other than that we don't mail or fax news releases, how else has technology changed and affected your career?
Technology has been a huge factor, and the news industry overall has just changed. What's so interesting is that with news releases, which is our staple, and back in the day, we would send out 200-300 news releases a year. We just don't do that anymore. So as the media has changed, for example, is we rarely send out news releases. All of our announcements are on social media. And so it used to be we would send out a news release, and these are the early days of Facebook and things like that. And they might make it to social media, they might not. But now it's social media is just a huge part of what we do, and also the way the reporters report the news. And so what's interesting is that in the quote-unquote old days where journalists would have to fact-check sources and look, now we'll do social media posts and those generate media stories, which is a good thing because it gets out things a lot, but is always not so great because the stories aren't always accurate and they'll embellish things. And so there's good and bad in that. But also now with Zoom, which is a whole nother story during the pandemic, for example, a lot of news crews didn't come and they asked to do Zoom interviews, which was fine. But now they still want to do Zoom interviews. And so it's hard for me because, for example, earlier this spring when we had to close parts of the park for flooding is a good example. And we had to announce that. Well, it was huge news. And so I had a lot of crews, TV crews in particular, that were coming to the park, but then several other news stations wanted to do Zoom interviews. And so it was hard for me because I would have 2 or 3 crews come and they'd be there in the morning and then a station would say, okay, but then go do a Zoom at noon and then go back out. And so it's just really hard. And so kind of the way I remedied that was I would do Zooms either the beginning of the day or at the end of the day. And to this day, I always used to say, if if a news cruise comes up to the park in person, they get first priority. And then if they're on the phone or a Zoom, then that's second priority. And an email is the third priority. Not only that, but just the number of outlets that used to be very clear. What was news, what was editorial. And then we got to blogs and opinion pieces. And so, for example, if I would do an interview with a reporter and the reporter either misquoted me or said something out of context, that, they would have a responsibility, a journalistic responsibility to report it accurately. And I would, call them on it. I prided myself on it. And it's really important. However, now with so much news just being generated by social media and with blogs and with these aggregators, things like Yahoo News and MSN, and it's not that they're bad, but so much of this stuff will go out and there will be a social media post. In fact, we just had one the other day about a mom and a bear cub up in Tuolumne Meadows that generated hundreds of news stories, and I didn't talk to any reporters. And so again, that's so interesting because there's so much stuff that can get out there, but when you're not dealing with reporters as a public relations person, it's really difficult to get your message across when the people are just getting it, whether it's a social media post or reading somebody else's story. So still a lot that needs to be worked out.
Certainly an industry in flux, and I think actually probably all industries are in flux, right, because of all of this. So you mentioned the roads being closed because of flooding, and that brings up a really important point that there's so many really fun, interesting things that you do as part of your job, and then there's also things that are a lot more serious. You mentioned a little while ago about a few folks who lost their lives in an incident in Yosemite, and fortunately, that is not what you have to deal with on a regular basis, but it is something that you have had to deal with throughout your career. Can you just maybe talk a little bit about dealing with the things that are really bad, and maybe from a communication standpoint, and also how you protect yourself personally? Because those things are hard.
That's a great question, and it's something that is a big part of my job, and it ebbs and flows like everything else, but, we'll get anywhere from 15 to 20 people that will lose their lives in the park every year. Now, some are just, a heart attack or stroke, it was their time, but we have every year people go over waterfalls. We have rock climbing accidents. For example, earlier this year, we had a rock fall, huge boulder came down on a truck and literally smashed a couple from the Bay Area. And so you have this, and these are just tragic stories. And so it's always a balancing act, because what I'll do, for example, is there's always interest in that, huge media interest. And so I certainly want to represent the park and satisfy the news media's interest. But at the same time, I also always tell myself these are human beings. And so as much as I love working with the press, it's things like this where press is at their worst, in my opinion, where they want the news, they want to know where are they from, what happened, and things like that. And so for me, there's a lot of things like we have legal things, like, for example, if somebody loses their life, you have to make sure what's called next of kin notification, their family members knew. Or if, for example, that person, we have a lot of international visitors. In this incident I mentioned in the rockfall earlier this spring, one of the people that were unfortunately killed was from China. She was from China. So you have to talk to the embassy. And so it's always those things. Then you'll have things like suicide. And so what I always try to do is I say, okay, I really try to balance getting the information out, and it's important, but at the same time realizing not only did these people lose their lives, but they've left behind family and friends. And to take it one step further, a good example is we have had several people go over waterfalls. And what I mean by this is someone will go to the top of the waterfall, they've been hiking, it's warm, they'll go to wash their face or wash their hands or go to get a drink of water, and they'll be swept over the waterfall. It's happened twice already this summer. It happens every year. And so when people do things like this, clearly they haven't made a good decision and they've done this. And so what I always try to balance is when the news is here and covering it, I tell myself, okay, what's the educational opportunity here? The educational opportunity is to make good decisions, to be very careful around smooth running water, and to cut to the chase is, don't play in a river above a waterfall. And so I want to get those messages out, but at the same time, I don't want to either say or imply that the people did something wrong, which of course they did. But at the same time, it's enough of a tragedy that it doesn't help, in my opinion, to say they made a bad decision. And so it's that balancing act. And I work with a lot of the people. What happens is if there's a fatality, we have what's called a family liaison officer. And so that's generally a fellow ranger, and he or she will work with the family. So sometimes I'll talk to the family and say, okay, how do you want me to talk about this person, or what do you want me to communicate? And so that's something I'm real proud of. I've always prided myself on looking at these people as human beings, whereas the press, and although I don't want to, point that they're heartless, but at the same time, sometimes they're so quick to get something out there and they're under such pressure, they don't realize that there's impacts to not only family members, but a lot of times, we had, for example, a young man from Israel fell to his death over Nevada Fall a couple of summers ago. Oh, he was with 30 other people in a youth group from Israel. And so they all saw this, and it quickly became national news in Israel. And it was very difficult because when the press would say to me, well, what did he do? Did he do something wrong? Well, he was trying to get a photo for Instagram and tried to get the photo and was basically, we feel, showing off, if you will, to his friends. And so it was certainly a tragedy that it happened. But I also, again, really want to make the point that, look, is hanging off a waterfall, it's not worth that just to get a photo, and better to be safe. And you could stand in front of the waterfall and get just as nice of a photo.
We'll switch gears a little bit. And I really want you to tell my favorite story, which is the story about Ranger Gabriel. This is just, I think this is a story of public relations at its finest and how it can do so much good, and also how things can kind of evolve in organic ways that you maybe didn't anticipate at the beginning. And so I'd love for you to tell our listeners about Ranger Gabriel.
I will, and thank you. Yep, to me, as I'm kind of getting chills, honestly, thinking about Ranger Gabe, because unfortunately I've been a little out of touch with him, and he's doing well. But this is a great example, is that, we got a call, this was several years ago, from the Make-A-Wish Foundation saying that, a young man from Florida who had a life-threatening disease wanted for his wish to come out to Yosemite and to be a park ranger. And so they asked if we would be up for that, and of course we said yes. And so when they came out, it was so interesting because they thought, okay, and we want to come and wear a hat. We wanted to make something out of it. So we said, okay, we're going to give him a whole day. We're going to have him put out a fire, lead a search and rescue, work with bears, do all of those kind of things. And so it's interesting because the Make-A-Wish Foundation had worked with CBS News and had a news crew that came out to do this. And we thought, okay, well, let's do this and let's invite other news crews. And of course, we certainly were cognizant of the fact that this it's a lot of fun. It's a very serious reason that he was there, for his wish. But at the same time, it was a great public relations opportunity. So we took him out and he was wonderful. In fact, my favorite quick story within the story of that was our firefighters actually set a fire on the ground, pulled him up, put the Nomex, which is the yellow fire retardant gear, on Gabriel. And at the time, he was about 9 years old and he was, a real small little guy. And the fire was going and they literally handed him the hose and said, put out the fire. And later our superintendent said, I didn't think they were actually going to start a fire, but he did that and he loved it. And he was clearly loved it and taking photos. And at the end, we swore him in as a ranger. And so after that visit, it was clear he just loved it. And he was just loved being in front of the camera. And I thought to myself, you know what? It doesn't have to end here. And so at the time, we were celebrating several milestone anniversaries in Yosemite. So one of them, for the 125th anniversary, we decided to make him the honorary chairman of the 125th anniversary. And so he came out and he was able to lead programs. He had his own Ranger Gabe. He had a Ranger hat, and we made him a shirt with a patch and a badge. And he did interviews, and we had local TV stations come out. And then with our centennial, the 100 anniversaries the next year, he came out again. And it was just wonderful because he was doing all of this media. And it was nice because, again, I kept talking to his mom and saying, look, he's not an actor. We don't want to use him as a prop, but does he really like this? And she says he does, and he loved it. And so it was so great because for him, he loved being, in the spotlight and to be a ranger in Yosemite. And it was also wonderful for the park because it showed that, look, this is the kind of stuff, the inspiration that we can have, that, a lot of kids with the Make-A-Wish, and I don't begrudge this at all, they'll want to, meet a football player, meet a baseball player. And for me as a park ranger, it was something like, this young man wants to be a park ranger, and we did everything. We made him a parking space, Ranger Gabe's Parking. And so we had a ceremony for the 125th anniversary, and he was the featured speaker. So I thought, well, he just can't walk up to the stage. He needs an escort, so we put him on a fire truck, and we had the fire truck with the lights going and escorted him in. And so he came to the park. We did this for 3 or 4 years, and he just absolutely loved it. And then he had Team Ranger Gabe, and he would do Make-A-Wish walks, and he would raise thousands of dollars, and he got such a high profile. It was just a wonderful story. And so this was a way through public relations that it was intended as just a visit. He gets his wish, but it turned into a relationship, and Gabe is doing great. He's 18 now, and he's doing well, and he's in college. And so it's just, I look back on that and say it was just magical moments. But Gabe would come with his parents and his twin sister, and some of those moments that we had with him were just absolutely priceless.
I really appreciate how this conversation just shares the huge scope of what you do in your role as the public affairs officer for Yosemite. Never a dull moment, I would assume. And also, the fact that you're able to support people at the, most challenging times in their lives, and also use your creativity to make magic, as you mentioned a minute ago. And I think that's really special. And I think that's a perfect time to ask the question about the future of the industry. And if someone were listening to this and contemplating going into the public relations world, what would you tell them?
I would just tell them that they just have to be flexible and pivot. It's so interesting now because as a public relations practitioner and, in my over 30 years, it's just been so wonderful to have meet all these great people and have all this great experience, but it continues to be a challenge. And so for me, someone coming in, I say, look, public relations, the stuff is still there. People just say, what's so interesting, someone who, and I'm not shy, I'm 59. And so in my day, things like the Associated Press or the Fresno Bee here in Fresno or the local stations are still there, but a lot of the regional news isn't there. And we're getting a lot more of the national news, and how we deliver messages is different. So, for example, videos and photos, when we'll do a post, it's just expected that we do photos and we do videos. And so I would just tell people that it's a changing industry. And so what's so interesting now, and that's what I love about Yosemite, is that I clearly love national parks, and I hope I'm conveying that. And as I tell the students that I've got to visit with over the years and working with you, is that, hey, the greatest thing, in my opinion, about public relations and do is that if you can marry your personal passion with your job, then that's the best. Because sometimes, like for example, I'll do an interview and I'll talk about the park, I'll talk about a bear, I'll talk about bighorn sheep, or I'll talk about, for example, we reintroduced red-legged frogs. And I do that. The reporters sometimes will say, wow, you're really excited about this, And for me, I always think in the back of my mind, it's nice because I am, and I am so excited, and so I don't have to fake it. So that's what I tell people, is that if you can be in a position and either represent an organization, or a person or a company or an institution that you personally feel passionate about, it not only makes you better at your job, but it makes you, a lot more authentic. And so I just think that as it's changing, the things of the media continues to change. And I thought for a little while, okay, it's kind of settling out, but, it's changing even more. And so it's just be adaptable and just realize that one thing, the way you do it, it's going to change. And it's one of those things where I feel that I get teased sometimes. Even my kids say to me, Dad, you don't like change and you want things the way they are. And I do. I'm a creature of habit, hence having the same job for 27 years. I think that, that makes it. But at the same time, it is fun for me now. Like, for example, going back to working with your students and learning a new campaign, and we're able to incorporate a lot of those new ways of doing it. So it's just exciting. And I would tell people it's just an industry that's changing, but it's exciting, and there's always going to be a need for it. What's interesting, we just realized a similar thing is in the park just last week, our locksmith retired, and locksmith Dave, and it was so interesting because as he was retiring and talking to him, he says, you know what, you can have all the technology, you can have all this, but there's always going to be locks. And there's always going to be a need for a lot. And that really resonated with me, saying, okay, he retires and he's in his late 60s, locksmith. And I look at it the same way, that for public relations, whether you're a company or organization, public relations, what we do as an industry is just crucial. And in fact, more and more crucial to what we do as press becomes more international. We used to say the 24-hour news cycle went to the 24-minute news cycle to now instantaneous news, how things go on. And so it's one of those things where the need to communicate on behalf of an organization is always going to be there. How it's done continues to evolve. And I just feel it's exciting. And I just, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but a lot of the things that we've done continue to change. But like I said, at the same time, I'll get just the other day out an AP reporter call, and AP is still there. But then on the other hand, someone else will, want to do something for Cheddar News or some new outlet. And so it just changes all the time, which is frankly really exciting.
Thank you so much. We have been here today with Scott Gediman, Public Affairs Officer and Park Ranger for Yosemite National Park, sharing about his 30-plus year career in the world of public relations and national parks. And we're so grateful for your time and inspiration and stories. Thank you so much for sharing, Scott.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Central Valley Stories, Advertising and Public Relations. Join us again next time as we talk history, trends, changes, and challenges with more of the region's veteran practitioners and agency owners. Until then, take care and be well.